Good evening to everyone, and welcome to week 4 of SEP 785 885. And tonight we're going to talk about the historical foundations of curriculum. I'm sure that all of you have heard this phrase in some form or the other. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So reviewing the history of education allows us to step outside of the here and now and gain a bigger picture and seeing ourselves within it, and realizing that the field of education must remain dynamic in order for us to be effective. Throughout history, curricular choices have been made out of necessity and to meet the specific needs of the society at that time. Also, it is through history that we see how predominant philosophies, the ones that we went over last week in class, have shaped the society's values, which have in turn determined the current purposes of education. Through history, we learned that programs are considered pioneering due to the different philosophies to which others subscribe. Also, in reviewing history, it becomes apparent that this has been the case throughout the centuries. Ideas change, and a group can break free of faulty suppositions. History shows us that what is now isn't necessarily what needs to remain. So just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean that we always have to do it that way. In history, we see why and how things came to be, how the demographics of a particular committee can have a long-reaching impact, and that comes from our textbook, and also that some traditions such as grading, if you know the grading scales, are relatively new concepts after all. So for just a moment, think about when you were in high school. For some of y'all, that might have been not so long ago, but for some of us, it's been a little bit longer. But think about when you were in high school and the high school curriculum that you experienced. What was offered, what were required courses, and what was optional. Do you think that it adequately prepared you for the next step in your life, whether you were going off to college, whether you were going into the military, or whether you were going straight to work? So let's take a minute to pause and think about that and think, did you really get a firm background in what you needed to know? Okay, so I always like to do something that kind of wakes your brain up when we first start. So we're going to have a little quiz on our knowledge of American education. So this is just to see how the system of education in America has evolved over the years. So for our first question, when was the first public school founded in the United States? Think about that for a minute. And after you've made your guess, the correct answer is C. It's 1635. John Cotton founded Boston Latin School in 1635. This was modeled after a school that was in England. So question number 2, what state was the first to require students to attend school? And the correct answer for this one is Massachusetts. Massachusetts in 1642 and 1647 started schools. Communities in Massachusetts began to require parents to send their children to school. Still, regularly attending school was very rare for families who were on the poverty level or didn't have a lot of resources. Okay, question number 3. What is a horn book? And the correct answer for this one is C. It is really a wooden panel students use to study lessons. They had lessons like the alphabet or some basic ciphering or numbers that they had to learn. And they actually had a transparent piece of horn used to cover the lessons to protect them while they were shared amongst the students. What were many schools throughout the United States once called? This one's fairly easy. I know everybody will get this one. They were called the one-room schools. One-room schools educated many students throughout rural areas of the United States. Students of all ages attended in classes together, and usually they only had one teacher. Okay, now we're getting a little easier. True or false? Students in the first schools did not have homework. And the answer to that is true. Because children were expected to help so much around the house or work when they were not in school, homework was very, very rare. Look at here, this crazy thing typed both of these as number 5. This is really number 6. Sorry about that. True, false, or maybe it's true and false. Summer break started so kids living on farms could help with the chores. So everybody got a question because I actually got this one wrong myself. It is both. In rural communities, schools closed in the spring and fall so students could help with planning and when it was time to do the harvest. But in the city, schools were opened almost all year round, but attendance during the summer was so very low that they might as well have not had school anyway. So question number 7, which college was the first college to have both men and women attend their college? And the answer to this one is Oberlin. Oberlin College is in Ohio, and it was the first school that had mixed gender classes. Number 8. What percentage of Americans had high school diplomas in 1910? Actually, only 9% of Americans had high school diplomas. But by 1935, because of changes in how the school system was set up and implemented and some mandatory schooling, that number jumped up to 40%. Number 9 should be really easy for everybody. What famous Supreme Court ruling said that separate but equal education is not okay? This actually happened in Virginia, and that is Brown versus the Board of Education. In 1954, the court ruled that segregation in schools is unconstitutional, and this landmark decision had implications for schools, but also segregation laws around the country. And our last question, what is a charter school? Because you hear a lot about that in the news. Do you really know what constitutes a charter school? So a charter school, they are publicly funded schools that are exempt from some of the guidelines or some of the federal regulations that public schools must follow in exchange for producing certain results, usually outlined in the school's charter. Minnesota was actually the first state to model this back in 1991. So that's our last quiz question. How did you do? I'm aware not everyone in this class is in public education, but public education has a very strong tie into the fabric of our society and sets the stage for those of us who work in higher education or as trainers. Public education has the unique opportunity to take students at an early age and develop, or not, their skills, their talents, and knowledge before they enter workforce or higher education. That's why it is very important to have a good understanding of how our educational system has developed over the years and its current status. So in going over these categories, and the first one we're going to go over is the colonial period, ask yourself why different items are where they are. By what process did they end up in one place rather than in another? So things that were previously but no longer generally taught in public schools are things like the Bible, computing cube roots, Grimm's fairy tales, Kipling's poems, Longfellow's poetry, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Latin, Greek, rhetoric, Robert's Rules of Order, things that didn't used to be taught in public education but are now generally taught in public ed. Computer literacy, functions, pre-calculus, world culture, substance abuse, things like that. Things that are still taught, but people rarely use them outside of school, but they're still considered part of education. Long division, computing square roots, synthetic division, formal grammar. Things that aren't generally useful but are not taught in what we consider the status or the elite, like college prep curriculum in many public education systems, auto maintenance, child care, cooking, woodwork, bookkeeping. Things not taught at all in public ed are usually not taught as a general rule, but are very useful. Home maintenance, how to manipulate the stock market, gardening, income tax preparation, and things like that. So these are, how can we explain why some things are taught and some aren't? Well, we'll see a great variety of factors that have influenced this arrangement over the years. So these are the things that, when you understand the history of how this came about, it helps you understand why education is where it is at this current point. So like I said, we'll start with the colonial period. The colonial schools, Massachusetts, as we said, was one of the first places to have schools, and a big part of the colonial period was the Deluder-Satan Act that required towns that had 50 or more families to appoint a reading and writing teacher. If you had 100 or more, you had to also appoint a Latin teacher so that your students would have a good chance of getting into Harvard. So in the Middle Atlantic, most of the schools were what we called private and parochial, and in the South, there was really not much attention to developing any kind of schools on a large-scale basis. As you see the town schools, and let me see if I can get the webcam off of this picture so you can see it just a little bit. Let me put myself way up here. Okay. It was mostly children 5 to 6, and by 13 they were done with school and they didn't go anymore. And as you see, a lot depended upon what was happening in society as to whether they actually attended class. We also had, like I said, parochial schools. And you see the different focus. They really had a lot of schooling that was focused on reading, writing, and religious education. Private schools had a little bit more focus on including some basic mathematical computation. And the charity schools really had a strong religious overtone to it, but it also tried to teach the students something that was practical that they could do to help them have a job. We also had the Latin grammar schools, and you can look through the list here of what they did in the Latin grammar schools, and we'll just clear that up by saying it was a very exhausting course of study, and it was not very exciting for any of the students. We also had academies that Benjamin Franklin had a lot to do with getting academies set up. And as you look through the list, you can see that students took what we consider the basics that they need to be a good citizen. But the interesting thing is that they chose a foreign language based on their vocational need. So if you were going to be a doctor, you would choose Latin. But if you were going to be a minister, you would choose Latin. But if you were going into some other type of field, you may choose a different language. As far as the colleges go, you see that Harvard or Yale, and you had to take an exam to get into college. And it's interesting, if you look on here, you'll see where it says, in order to get into college or to be proficient in college, you had to be able to read, construe, and parse Tully, Virgil, and the Greek Testament. So Tully refers to Marcus Tullius Cicero, and we anglicized it as Tully, who was a Roman orator and statesman. Let's see what else they do that's interesting in here. If you see right here, it says you have to understand the rules of Procedia. Procedia Gracia is an exposition of Greek meters by rules and examples. So we go to the next, and we talk about the textbooks, and you will see some of the early books that they used. They talk a little bit about the Horn book here and the primer. They also used the Bible a lot. They learned the alphabet, and they learned a lot of the English language by doing the Lord's Prayer or reading things in the Bible, because that was the most common book that was available. So that's why it was used so heavily. The New England Primer was also a very important book, and it was in use for almost 100 years before it was replaced, and they just continued to use that book over and over. So that was in the colonial period, and now we are going to move up to the next period that influenced public education, which is the national period from 76 to 1850. Now, some of you may be familiar with the name of Benjamin Rush, and he had a lot to do with outlining how schools should be set up so that everyone has an opportunity to receive a free education. He was also a very strong proponent of having free colleges and universities, because he felt like this helped promote the wealth and the knowledge base of society. He also said that, tax dollars should pay for our colleges, but it was important to have colleges for our students to go to, because, like I said, it helps increase your society and have a better citizenry. Then we come to Thomas Jefferson, which most people are familiar with, and he also came up with the idea that Virginia's taxes should help pay for the schools. He had a plan to divide Virginia's counties into different wards and have public education wards, which they have in some southern states, but this never happened because he wasn't able to get this to go through. But his plan was everybody could go to elementary school for free, and then there would be grammar schools and scholarship students. And so if you fell in a certain category, you went to the grammar school, and half of you would become teachers. And then the other students of the highest caliber would attend, of course, in Jefferson's view, the only important college in Virginia, which is the College of William and Mary, or William and Mary College. Then we also have Noah Webster, who was also pretty prominent back then, but he had a very nationalist approach, and he is the guy who wrote the dictionary, but he helped create a standard for American language, which was very important at that time. Then we have McGuffey, which I'm sure in your reading or at some point in your life you have heard of the famous McGuffey Reader, and his book is still used some today in other places. He did promote the use of phonics to learn to read, not whole word or sight reading, which was in vogue there for a few years a while back. But he had a strong influence on standardizing what we consider to be the American/English that we use. So just a few minutes to think, and I'm not going to really hold up the screen while y'all are thinking, but when we talk about it, the national period provided a change in education, the beginning of the American English language, because that's when they really codified it and made it part of the language. So would we have a national system of education if these people's theories, Jefferson and Webster, if their theories had been adopted, and enacted? You know, some places have a national system of education. I just finished a study about technology education in other countries, in Australia, Sweden, England. They have national education that goes out to all the different counties and wards, or however they divide up their system. But all of their information comes from a national government Ministry of Education. Would that be better for the United States? Yes, we have we have a national, federal, whatever you want to call it, Department of Education. But they hand down mandates and they hand down rules and regulations, but we still have a lot of freedom because each state is responsible for its own education. So think about that for a minute or two. Do you think it would change how education is in the U.S. if back in the 17s to 1850s we had adopted a national way to do our education? And along with that, we have what I call our legacy grading system was developed during this period. So, you know, at the time they came up with A, B, C, D, F. Do you feel that it's true to its original intent? Do you think that an A is really an A like it was when they first came up with it? Do you think it's effective for today's students? Does it really reflect whether students have mastered the content and the subject matter? So think about that. Why or why not? And if you don't like it, what do you think would be a better way to do it? Or is there one way to actually do that? So now we're moving into the 19th century, and we have a lot of influence from our European educators. So I'm sure that most of y'all have heard of Pestalozzi, and he helped reform how we do elementary school, and he said that, you know, we needed to have more emphasis on the teachers giving emotional security and affection to the students instead of being a very stern taskmaster, and that we also needed to have something to make sure that our students are not just getting books to read and things like that, but something that considers their auditory and their visual experiences. You will see the Americans down here who brought this to the U.S., McClure, Neef, Mann, that's Horace Mann, and Barnard, they introduced these ideas. Another big influence to the American education system was Friedrich Froebel, who came up with the concept of kindergarten. Before then, nobody thought much about 3 and 4-year-olds. I mean, they're just little children that should be seen and not heard, so why are we concerned about this? But he had a much different perspective on the importance of nurturing children at this age. Then we have Johann Herbart, who said, okay, so now we need to think about the moral and intellectual development of our students. And he said that we need to have something called concept correlation, that each subject should be taught in a way that it relates and refers to other subjects. Have we heard that before? Yes, we have. But it was radical back in his time. Think of scaffolding. Building on learners' previous knowledge and having an integrated system in which new ideas could be related to the knowledge. So his system, as you see, has preparation. The teacher would prepare learners for new content by referring to the previous learning. Presentation, the teacher presents the new content. Association, make those deliberate connections between the new and the previous learning. Systemization, using examples to help learners learn and master the new content. And then application, or the doing of it, testing the new ideas and the materials to assess the student mastery. Then we had Spencer, who said, okay, now we got to have utilitarian and a scientific approach to education, and a lot of his way of presenting education dealt with survival of the fittest. If you did not really put forth effort, then you were lazy or weak and you would not survive. So he thought it was important to teach people how to think, not what to think. Now we're at the rise of universal education. At this point in time in American history, we put a strong value on equality and rugged individualism. We had schools called monitorial schools where the bright students taught their classmates. We had common schools that went with the elementary with the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Horace Mann was a huge proponent of these schools. We had schools called the Academy, which was college prep or practical programs. And this is where high schools really came into being. There was a decision called the Kalamazoo decision in 1874 that came up with the concept of a comprehensive high school. So like I said, we had the monitorial schools. These were based on a European concept, but it was a very prescribed and mechanical way of teaching the students. Then we had the common schools, which we said from the quiz at the beginning was established in Massachusetts, and they had their own board of education. Students went, and it was not anything to get excited, but it was at least a chance to get some type of education. Elementary schools started, but they had a hard time trying to decide what it was the children really needed to learn. And as you can see, it kind of changed over the years. They couldn't agree. Then they thought you needed morality and religion. Then they added more things in to the education. Secondary schools, as you see, in 1900, it says here that 11.5% of students age 14 to 17 were in school, but only 6.5% of them graduated, up to the 70s, where now 98% of elementary children do go from elementary school to secondary education. So it's changed from the 1900s, but it took 70 years to get where you had more students who were young succeeding and staying in school. Then we had the academies, and these replaced what they used to call the Latin grammar schools. It did have a nicer curriculum. It had more information in it. They did continue to be around. They helped students prepare for college, but it was also a place for young women to go to get a little bit of education, and it helped them with their what they called finishing and having them be ready to be presented in society. Talked about high schools coming into existence. They decided that high schools needed to be supported by public taxes because they would help students be ready for college, or it would have another track where it would help prepare people to be in the workforce and help the American economy. Now we've moved up to the transitional period, which kind of overlaps a little bit, but it is a period all of its own because there were some very important things that happened during this period. The first was what they called the Committee of 15. These get a little confusing because they just called them committees of numbers, but the first Committee of 15, you see, Charles Eliot was very important with this, but they said what you need to do is ensure that we have English grammar, literature, geography, and history. These are important. Hygiene, culture, things like that. They wanted to keep everything compartmentalized in an educational system, and they didn't want to introduce any newer subjects or anything different from what they consider the classic things people needed to learn. Then we had the Committee of 10, also chaired by the same guy, but then they started talking a little bit more, and this is the big one. This is the one that came up with the academic subjects that we still pretty much teach today in secondary education. There were 4 tracks. There was no art, no music, PE, or any of that stuff. This was all about getting the people ready so that they could move forward to higher education. Then they had a committee called the College Entrance Requirements, and this is where they came up with the Carnegie Unit, which everybody is familiar with now. You see CEUs written down all the time, or CUEs. No, it's CEUs. They came up with what they called entrance requirements for going into higher education. And per its original definition, a Carnegie unit is 120 hours of class or contact time with an instructor over a course of whatever time. It was originally a year, but that's been changed around a little bit at the high school level. Strictly speaking, this breaks down into a 1-hour meeting on each of the 5 days per week for 24 weeks out of the year. Then we have Harris and Eliot, still the same guy, Eliot, but they were very conservative reformers, and you can see some of the things that they wrote. They thought that high school should still have some kind of influence on the students about morality and citizenship and social order. But Eliot had a lot to do with making sure that high schools were set up, and they're still set up the same way that he envisioned that they should be. Vocational education, back in 1917, the Smith-Hughes Act said, okay, hey, we need to start having some money to fund these kind of programs. And it was a way to track students, and because they felt that a lot of students who came from working class families didn't have the educational background to succeed and go to college, so they were placed in the vocational track a lot. So Abraham Flexner in uh, the early 1900s, came up with what he called a modern curriculum. And he said that there were things that we needed to change and that we should get rid of teaching Latin because it was no longer relevant for the majority of the students who were in the high schools. But he did say that we needed to have science and industry, civics, and aesthetics. Most of you are familiar with John Dewey, and we talked about pragmatism last week in class and his philosophy of education. You can see what he thought were the main components of what were important for education at this time. Charles Judd was also someone else who believed that we needed to help students learn to deal with problems and not just sit and learn endless rote subjects. So he was very much into that. Now, another big event that occurred in education was when we had, in 1918, when we had the Commission on Reorganization of Secondary Education. The National Education Association came out with this, and they said there are certain things that we have to have in order for education to be democratic and serve our democratic society. There were 7 aims: health, command of fundamentals, worthy home membership, which is preparation for marriage and childbirth and children, vocation, citizenship, leisure, and an ethical character. So the high school curriculum met varied needs: agriculture, business, commercial, vocational, and college prep. Current educational psychology for the time was applied, such as psychological principles and methods of measurement and evaluation, and they applied all this to the instruction. But there was a strong emphasis on the whole child in this commission report and this reorganization of secondary education. So Franklin Bobbitt and W.W. Charters came along, and they also had some ideas that they thought they were very much behaviorists, and that they thought that students should have a lot to do with what happens in the classroom. So you can see from here the things that they thought were important. They had a behaviorist background, and Bobbitt said these are things that are important, that we need to involve the community, and that you need to make sure that you have differentiated objectives for different students or to meet a student's needs. Charters also had some of the very same types of ideas, but he said that we need to have aims and objectives and understand what it is, the needs of our students and of our learners. Kilpatrick was another very important person at that time, but he had the progressive influence, as we talked about last week. And so he said it's very important that we have integrated subject matter, or we have cross-curricular types of things, and that we need to make sure that we have organized experiences for our learners. There was a publication that came out called the 26th Yearbook, and it had some very important people in it. You see Bobbitt and Charters and Kilpatrick and all that. It was actually 2 volumes long when they wrote it. They wrote it in the 1930s. And this book basically outlines what they consider to be the ideal curriculum for students. And if you read through the list, some of the things should seem very familiar, but they talk about humanitarianism, they talk about students' interests and needs, which was quite a change from back in the colonial and the other periods. Then we go to Rugg and Caswell, and they were the first ones who really started talking about, okay, what is the scope and sequence? What is proper scope and sequence when we're talking about the subject matter that we wanted? And this is where they started coming up with, okay, teachers should plan before they go in to teach the curriculum, and they should be aware of their students' needs. They also thought that you should help teachers coordinate the activities with what they are teaching and what the students need to learn in the classroom. Oops, sorry, hit one too many. So you see the step-by-step directions that they have, and they said if you can't answer all these questions with your curriculum, then you need to go back and revise it. Then we had another study that came out in 32 called, surprisingly, the 8-year study, and this was an organization called the Progressive Education Association, and they said they want to try to see if what we're teaching, the curriculum, what the organizations or the public education entities, is it really based on the needs of the students, as well as a curriculum that is based on what they need to test and master to get out of school. So they said that, you have to have some type of assessment or evaluation to ensure that the students are really learning what they're supposed to. So this was the beginning of people saying we need data to support what we're doing to prove that we're really educating the students. We talked a little bit about Ralph Tyler last week in class also. You can see he was a very prolific writer, but he had 4 basic questions for any curriculum, no matter what curriculum that you are looking at. But he said if you can answer these 4 questions, then you have a good solid foundation to your curriculum. So you can read over these questions and see how they fit in with what we're doing in class. John Goodlad, we also talked about him last week. He thought that, schools are there to help fulfill their potential, but also we have to make sure that society meets its goals. So he had a lot to do with making sure that not only do we ensure that students meet the tests and capacity assessments, but are they also fulfilling their potential as learners? William Pinar was another one, and he's still around, and he said that, we need to be more concerned about what students need to learn, what is worth learning, rather than being so caught into this lockstep type of curriculum that most schools have. I always mess up this guy's name, so let me say Paulo Freire, I think. I'm terrible, so if somebody's better at this, you can send me a voice clip and tell me how to say it better. But he was more thinking that, education is kind of like banking. You as the knowledge person deposit it to your students, and then your students draw it out and use it as they need it, kind of like a checking account. But he thought that it had to do with where you are, what's important to you at that time, and definitely that knowledge is power. So just a couple questions for you to ponder, because obviously we're not having a live class, so we won't discuss it. But think about this to yourself and really consider, what are the costs and benefits of teaching to the test? Because a lot of people say that's what happens now with all this standards-based testing that goes on. So what are the costs and benefits of teaching to the test or not teaching to the test? These costs and benefits benefit who? The learner or the institution, or why? Should you do it? Should you not do it? What are the benefits? Are there any benefits? So right now in education and in curriculum, the current focus is on accountability. And you can't reduce curriculum to just a particular theory, plan, or definition. As we talked last week in class, a lot of different philosophical foundations and educational theories come into play into the curriculum, plus the background and culture of the learners and the person presenting the curriculum. So we use all this information that we learn just as tools to help us develop a curriculum that we hope will benefit the needs of the learners that we have in front of us. So let's think about some of the stuff. What are some key historical foundations that should be taken in account when you develop curriculum in STEM, CTE, or in your primary area of training or education? So if you're presenting education for people in the military, what are some of the historical things that we've learned that you know would benefit learners in this type of hierarchical type of learning environment or this particular situation? So when you think about history, how does that come into play with what you're trying to do in your area of expertise? So in summary, we know that you have to understand the history and the knowledge that they had back then and what's come forward in education so that you can take all of these and put them together and come up with a good way to ensure that you engage your learners. We talked about Tyler's model last week. Remember, it was the bubbles with the different wheels around it, and that is still primarily what is used to develop curriculum even today. But if you see that the current theorists, the ones that are currently in the major areas that people are discussing now, a lot of these theorists feel like that schools have an unequal distribution of cultural and educational capital. And we know that cultural, social, and educational capital are necessary elements for students to experience success in the workplace, the community, and higher education settings. If you don't understand the cultural capital of what it means to be in a STEM career field or in the military, if you don't understand the nuances of the language and the way people dress and the way people act, it's hard for you to assimilate and become part of that culture. So that is something that these theorists are saying that they feel is a shortcoming in the current way that education is taught. So this concludes class for week 4, and I hope that you were able to understand some of the history of it. As usual, I will post this with the narrated, but I'll also post the regular PowerPoint. So if you want to just go back and look at it and look at a few slides a little more in depth, it'll be there available for you. So thank you and good evening.